Alright, welcome everybody. Today I'm going to explain how to make a small little Discord bot, and specifically I was requested to make a Discord bot that has a command which can count the amount of reactions messages get in a specific channel. We're going to assume that you have a basic Discord bot working already. So the code you see here is simply a bot that starts and says it's active. It doesn't do anything else. If you do not know how to make this, please look up a specific tutorial for setting up a Discord bot itself. So first things first, we're going to need to save a little bit of information. One of these is where we want to store the data that we gather from the messages. We're going to simply create a save path that points to a folder on our PC. You can make this anything you want. Next, we want a list of column names. And basically, our file that we're going to create is a CSV file, and it's going to have a few columns. And these columns will represent the data that we want to store from each message. So we want the message ID, the URL that easily links us to the message if we need to find it later, the amount of reactions the message got, the date at which the message was posted, and the actual text content of the message. And lastly, we want the guilds that we want to register this command to. So specifically the guild IDs where the bot should register the command we are going to create. Right, let's start actually making the command itself. We'll have to start with a decorator, a /command decorator. This is going to tell Python that the next function we make is a /command. So you simply do add bot./command. Bot is the Discord bot that we made beforehand, and /command is the function to create a /command. We're going to give this guild IDs, which is the list of guild IDs we specified earlier, the guilds where the /command will be registered. We will set guild only to true to ensure this command cannot be used in DMs, and we'll give it a description. This is just nice to have, really. Next, we need the actual function itself. So let's start with a simple function that has nothing in it just yet. We need to create an asynchronous function. This is something that has to happen when you work with Pycord. And we will call it gather reactions. This is also the name that the bot will give it in the actual Discord server. So if you want to change the name, you have to change this function name. The first parameter it will have is the context. This is basically the context in which the command was used. This contains various bits of information that we might need to use later. In this case, to actually send a response back to the user. We also want to get some information from the user itself. You see, we don't just want to look at all messages in a channel. That would be quite a few, especially if the channel is old. We want to get all messages after a certain date. And we can define this easily by asking the user to specify how many days back from now to look. We'll call this variable days back. But we can't just say days back in and of itself, because Pycord won't know what this actually is supposed to be. Is it a piece of text? Is it a number? And in this case, we specifically want a number from the user. And we can specify this by adding a discord.option. And a discord.option is basically a special class that Pycord created that'll tell Pycord to ask only numbers. We do this by specifying that an integer should be asked. We can also give a small description that will be displayed to the user so that they know what this actually is supposed to be. And next we'll want the actual channel to go to, and we'll call this target channel. And target channel is also going to be a Discord option, but not just an integer. No, we want specifically a text channel, so a channel where you can post text messages. And we can specify this by using the discord.textChannel class. And when the user is entering this parameter, they will get a nice a list from Discord where they can choose their text channel. It's quite easy. And also a little description to tell the user what this is all about. Let's put this in place so it looks nice. And then we can start with the actual function. So first things first, we have specified the channel that we want to actually read from, but we'll need to load it from memory. And we can get this by using the get channel command. The get channel command basically looks into the memory of the baud. So you do this by baud.getChannel, and it searches the baud for all channels with the specific ID, which is obviously only one. And we can get this ID from the channel that the user specified. So we say target channel dot ID, which gives us the ID of the target channel, which will then be loaded into the channel variable, which we can use later to find all of the messages inside of it. We'll also need to actually get the date that is the days back in time. So we can do this quite simply by first getting the current time. But you see, we'll need a special package for this because Python doesn't actually know this by default. So what you need to do is on top of your code file, import from datetime. You want to import datetime, time delta, and time zone. And these we can use to get a date back in the past. So you can see with the datetime.now method, we will receive the current date, and we specifically want it in the UTC time zone because this is what Discord understands. If you use a different time zone, weird things might happen. Okay, but we don't want the messages from today. We want the messages from today minus the times back. We can do this by simply grabbing the current time minus a time delta with the amount of days that the user specified over here, days back. So if the user were to say enter 30, it would go 30 days back in time from right now. We'll use this date to find only the messages after the time target. Next, we can prepare a simple list that is currently empty, and we will be filling this with all the message data that we collect. And this list will then be used to create a CSV file after we are done collecting all the data. How do we actually get the messages from the channel? And we can do this by looping through the history of the channel. So what is channel.history? Well, we have this channel object right here, and we got this from the getChannel method. And each channel has a history function, and basically that'll give you a big old list of every single message posted in that channel. But as we already said, we don't want every message. We only want messages that are after the time target. You can specify this with the after parameter. And you will see that this is kind of a weird loop. It's an async for loop instead of a normal for loop. Well, that's because channel.history is actually an asynchronous function, and we can use async for loops to still use them in a standard for loop without having to first load the entire history and then looping through it like normally. Before we continue making our loop, I think it's quite important to understand how the bot actually structures all the data that we want to receive. And this image you can see right now, we have the first object. This is our channel, which we defined with the getChannel. And each channel actually contains multiple messages, and we don't necessarily know how many. But that's not really a problem because we go through all of them. But every message actually contains a list of every reaction on that message. Basically, this means that we have to not only loop through all the messages in a channel, but also for every message, loop through every reaction in order to count how many reactions the message has. So we are now in our loop, and we are going through every single message after our certain time target. Now, what do we first want to do? Well, quite simply, we want to count how many reactions each message has. So remember, every message has another list inside of it that is a list of every reaction. So what we can do is we first start our reaction counter at 0, and from there we start a new for loop. We want to access all of the reactions inside the message. You can do this by saying message.reactions, and for every reaction we simply want to add the reaction.count value, reaction.count, which is the amount of times this reaction was used, and we want to add that to the reaction counter. And then once this loop finishes, it'll have a total number of reactions on that message, which could be 0 if there are none, but it could be quite a lot if a lot of people reacted. Okay, that is our reaction count, but we also want some data from the message itself, and we can do this by creating a list of different things that we want to collect from the message itself. And as we already have said up above, we want the message ID, the URL, the reaction count, the date, and the message content. And we have to provide this information in the same order as we did here in order to ensure that the correct information is in the correct column. So first we start with the ID. We simply create a data list, and the first entry will be the message.id, and then we want the URL, which is message.jumpURL. Next, our reaction count, which we created up here. Then we want the message.createdAdd, but createdAdd actually gives us a date time object like the one we created up here, but we don't want a datetime object, we just want a piece of text, so we convert it to a string by using the string method. And lastly, we add the message.content, but do keep in mind that by default bots cannot access message content anymore. You actually need to enable the intent for that, and we can do that at the start. When we have our default intents object, we can add the intent message.content equals true, which will set message content intent to true. And this ensures that we can actually read the text content of messages. Do keep in mind that this is something you also need to enable in the bot settings back on the Discord website. If you haven't done this, you should do that now. Or you can also just not add the message contents to your data if that's not something that interests you. So now that we have our list of message data, we can actually add it to that list we made before. Remember right here, our empty message data list, we will simply add our data collected for messages. And you should see this as basically every time we create this list for each message, that is a row in our CSV file. And this message data list will be the entire data collection that we then transfer to a CSV file. Alright, we are done collecting data per message, so we can finally leave our big for loop. And we can move back a little bit and start actually saving this to a file. So what we need is first to determine the name of the file that we want to use. But also we need to specify where Python should save this file. And to do this, we use a special function from OS called path.join. And basically path.join connects two separate file paths together into one. So at the start, we created our save path, and this is the folder where we want our files to be placed in. In this case, I have it in this folder right here. And next we want to actually specify the name of the file. And we can do this using an F string. An F string is basically just a string where you place an F in front. And when you do this, you can use these brackets right here to add a variable inside. And in our case, we add the current time because I wanted the files to be named after the time they were created. And we add .csv on the end, which will create our CSV file. There is a little problem, however. The current time is basically all of the time data of the current time, which includes milliseconds, which is a little bit too much detail for me. So what we can do is if we add the dots right there, we can actually specify which parts of the time it should say. And this is a special function in Python where if you're working with date times, you can use these special strings right here to specify which parts should actually be turned into text. Right now, this is basically the month in text, which is %b. And this would say, if it were February, it would say Feb. Then it adds a space. %d is the day, so February 1st would be 1. Then it says %y, which is the year, 2022 in this case. And then I also added the milliseconds. So if you create multiple files on the same day, you want them to have a unique name, otherwise they will overwrite each other. So by adding the milliseconds, you basically ensure that it's always going to have a slightly different name, because this adds a few pretty much random numbers to it. Next, we need to actually create the CSV file in question. And we can do this using the CSV package. First, we need to open a file on the PC. And we can do this with the with statement, with, and then the open function. We use the file name that we specified earlier, and then we put a little string in here that's just a W, which will tell Python that we wish to write a file, not just read it. And then to make it a little simpler, we say as file, which will store this file into the file variable, which we can then use down below. So to continue here, you will need to actually import the CSV package. This is default with Python. You should not need to install anything. Just add that to your imports up top. And then we can continue. So to write a CSV file, we need to start a CSV writer, and we do this like so. The CSV module has a writer function, and we simply specify the file we wish to write to, and then the delimiter, in this case a comma, which is basically going to tell it to separate bits of data using a comma. And in this case, that's important to know that if your data contains commas, this could cause issues. And you might want to change this to something else, like for instance, a special character, a space, a dot. You can choose anything really, just pick something you enjoy. Next, we need to actually specify what this writer is going to write into the file. So first we want to write our column names, and we do this with the write row function, and we already prepared them up top. This is the list of names. Just make sure that the column names are at the top of the file. And then we want to write all of our data, and we can do this with the write rows function. Note the S here. This will write multiple rows, not just a single one. And then we enter the message data, which is this list that we filled up earlier using the for loop. This will create a file on your computer in the CSV format, which will first contain the column names, and then for every message that was found after the time date the user specified in the channel the user specified, and then every message will contain all of the data that we added in this list over here. Now, one final thing, we'll want to let our user know that this was actually successful. So we can send them a response, and this is where the context parameter, this one right up here, will come in use. We can use context.respond, make sure to await this, and we can send it a little message. I've used another f string here so that I can actually tell the user where the file is that was created and what file this is. We can use the file name variable we created earlier to just tell the user we saved it to this file. And make sure to add ephemeral equals true. That'll make sure that only the user of the command can see the response. Otherwise, everyone else in the server can see where you stored your files, and maybe that contains some sensitive folder names that you don't want anyone to read. So make sure you add ephemeral equals true. This is pretty much it. The user can now use this command, specify the channel, specify how many days to go back, and it'll create a neat little file containing all the data that we wanted. Now, if you wish to expand on this, there's a few things you could do. For instance, you might want to also store the author of the message. And it's quite simple. You just add another line, message.author, and then maybe their name or their ID, whatever you think is nicer. Make sure to also add the actual column as well. Let's say username, so that it has its own column name. And you can expand from here. Perhaps you want to only count reactions done by individual users, so that when a single user reacts multiple times, that's not counted. You could account for that over here. Or maybe you want to only look at the messages that the user himself sends. So when somebody uses this function, only his own messages will be read. You could also check each message to see if they are the author of that message. There's many things you could still do with this, but for now, this is the basic functionality as requested, and have fun.